building on our conversation on how challenging it is to drive this reform at the agency level, we're going to talk about what to do to institutionalize pretext reforms and to limit low-level stops in city councils and state legislators across the country. And we're thrilled to have the people doing that work and who have done that work here with us today. And I'll just do a little shout out that thinking through the options and the bill drafting and the policies on the table was really what drove us to start the Traffic Safety for All Coalition, to make sure the bills that we're putting forth are as strong as possible, to learn from each other. And we summarized some of that early learning in a document that's in your folders. That's a bill drafting guide. So that really gets into like the wonky meat of some of these policies, but we're gonna hear today about those options, the challenges of working with law enforcement in your communities when they are or are not supportive, and all those things. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Daniela Gilbert, who's going to introduce our panel. Thank you all so much for being here.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So excited to be having this conversation. I'm Daniela Gilbert. I lead the Redefining Public Safety Initiative at the Vera Institute of Justice, and it's great to see many familiar faces and new colleagues. So I'd love for each of you, please, to introduce yourselves and share your title, certainly, and also what brought you to this work.
Well, thank you. My name is Ron Thomas, and I'm the police chief for the city of Denver. And what brought me to this work is actually immediately after George Floyd, there was a convening of an organization called Reimagining Policing and Public Safety. And Councilman Kashmann and I both were sort of members of this group that convened on a regular basis to talk about how to do things differently as it relates to public safety. And actually, the Vera Institute gave a presentation during one of those convenings and talked about limiting and reducing traffic stops and how that could be helpful to communities in reimagining how public safety went in our city. And so, I have that effect on microphones. But anyway, and about the same time, I know Councilman Kashmann was also contemplating legislation as it related to limiting traffic stops. And he was asking for data from my data team, and I was actually collecting data from my data team. And as I started to review that data, I recognized that we conducted an awful lot of traffic stops, and at the end of that was a lot of nothing. A lot of, no arrests, no citations, no recovery of, contraband or weapons or anything like that. So it really started to seem like we were potentially wasting our time, impacting a lot of community. And, another thing that was going on at the time and still kind of goes on to this day is, time is of the essence for police officers. We have significant demands. Our call loads were increasing. The amount of time that it was taking us to get to calls was decreasing. And so I thought that there was some value in limiting the traffic stops that we conducted, which would, one, give us more time to do other more important things, namely, more important traffic safety things, more important community safety efforts, and also limit the opportunities that we engage with people for seemingly really no good reason and no good outcome. And so, I knew that the councilman was considering policy, and I asked him, can you let me do this through policy instead, because I think I can do it faster, and I think that I can do it without maybe some of the unintended consequences that might come from some sort of limitation on 10 specific or 7 specific violations. And so I said, I'd like to make it so that, one of the policies that I studied, I think it's Raleigh, North Carolina, I think does a policy where, and they did some research where they made it so that if you are going to conduct a non-safety related stop, you have to document your reasoning why, and you have to connect it to some reasonable suspicion of a specific crime occurring. And what they recognize is that there was a significant decrease in stops, a significant increase in the value of those stops. And so I crafted something very similar. And instead of just focusing on 7 or 10 different violations, I basically drafted a policy that said anything that isn't safety related, so speeding or DUI or traffic signal violations, you cannot do unless you articulate in a report exactly your reasonings for doing. And what we found was that we saw significant reductions in stops, and maybe I'll have an opportunity to talk about how it did not have an impact on crime or community safety.
Well, good morning. It's good to be here. My name is Paul Kashmann. I do serve on the Denver City Council, parts of South Denver. Denver, like most cities that I talk to, has taken over the years the vast majority of its public safety budget and devoted it to traditional badge and gun policing, and giving a half-hearted nod to what I think of as the public health context that contributes to public safety, be that poverty, mental health, drug addiction, no less inherent racism. And when I started looking at what to do about that, I became connected with the Vera Institute, and we were looking at a creation of an Office of Neighborhood Safety, which would become kind of the house for non-badge and gun public safety-related enterprise. And we did that, and then followed up, took part in a cohort on pretextual stops and started learning the truth about that. I'll start by telling you something that is painfully obvious. I am a white guy, okay? And I'll tell you a story about Paul, and that is that right now in my life, as an older white guy, I behave pretty well, my private life and my public life. There were a lot of years where I didn't. There were many times where I had no business being behind the wheel of a car. I was never pulled over for no reason, and I was never pulled over all those times when there was a real good reason. So with that, I started getting serious about looking at what Denver should do, and went to Chief Thomas and said, prepared for a good fight, and said, Chief, this is what I'm thinking of. And he said, I've been thinking the very same thing. And as he said, I'd like to do this in policy rather than ordinance. And what I told him was, well, I'm a legislator, and I want to get it into ordinance, but sure, let's start with the policy. Let's look at it for a while, see what's going on, and then we can decide what's the best way to proceed. And I will just tell you that recently, just a few days ago, I was given a bunch of data on where the number of stops has gone since the implementation of the policy, and I think it's not showing the degree of success I would like it to show. So I think the chief and I have some discussion to do when we get back to Denver town and see how Denver needs to move forward. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. I'm grateful for the opportunity. My name is Chauncee Smith, and I'm a director at Catalyst California, an organization that works to advance racial and economic justice on behalf of low-income communities of color. We conduct rigorous public policy research, data analysis, and advocacy. And in my role, I oversee our work related to criminal legal system reform and community safety issues. As part of that, I lead a coalition called PUSH LA, which stands for Promoting Unity, Safety, and Health in Los Angeles. And PUSH LA came together in 2019 in the wake of a report by the Los Angeles Times, which found that LAPD's Metro Division was stopping Black people at a rate 5 times greater than their share of the city population and 2 times greater than white people. And these practices were particularly concentrated within South Los Angeles, which is a part of LA that is historically a Black community, and has long been devastated by issues of racially biased policing, going all the way back to the LA riots in 1992, or uprisings, some would say, and the Rodney King beating, right? So given this history, when this data came out, it did a couple things. One, it really affirmed and provided clear evidence of what people had been saying and living through for many generations. And it also served as a clear starting point to galvanize folks together to create a broad cross-sector power block to address the issue of racially biased policing in the city of Los Angeles. So since then, we've been working in partnership with a wide variety of organizations locally to end pretextual stops, which from our standpoint is one of the more nefarious practices that's being used for racial profiling in the city of Los Angeles. And we work in close partnership with the council president, Marqueece Harris-Dawson here, who for many years has been a leader for us and is the primary champion of a motion that we're running to end racially biased pretextual stops in the city of Los Angeles.
Good morning. My name is Councilman Isaiah Thomas. I'm a councilperson at large, which means I represent the entire city of Philadelphia. I'm also the majority whip on city council. And what brings me here is that I was actually able to pass the first of its kind, which is the most progressive policy that we've seen in the entire country as it relates to addressing these traffic stops that we're discussing today. The name of the bill, thank you. The name of the bill is called Driving Equality. I actually introduced the bill very early in my political career. And honestly, I introduced the bill because I am a product of like that Michael Bloomberg style of mayoring, right? So when you talk about the idea of experimenting around stop and frisk, that was my generation. That was me, right? We are the generation of young people who are inspired to make change as it relates to not just traffic stops, but stops in general, because we are the demographic who suffered the most as it relates to being stopped. And honestly, the part that we don't talk enough about is the search. The search is the conversation that a lot of men are uncomfortable with, because the reality is that I don't know how it is when everyone else gets searched, because I'm not that space, but when we get searched as Black men, I call it soft rape, honestly. I have no other way to describe it, because you are having someone put their hands in your private parts without your permission. And this was a norm for us growing up in the city of Philadelphia, and a lot of us didn't realize it wasn't the norm until we stepped outside of our city and realized what other people experience. And that's when it hit us like, hold on, time out. Not only are these stops not the norm for everybody, but the way they search us, they're not supposed to search us that way. So that is really what put the battery in my back, and that's what inspired me to pass driving equality. I'll talk a lot about the process throughout the course of our time today. But basically, the legislation looks at 8 traffic violations that we took and we moved from a primary means of enforcement, which means we enforce it with a traffic stop, to a secondary means of enforcement, which means that if you commit a motor vehicle code violation that we consider as a public safety hazard, running a stop sign, speeding, turning left where you're not supposed to turn left, and on top of that, you have one of these other minor violations, like emission stickers or inspection stickers or minor bumper damage to the bumper or one taillight out, that means that we'll enforce these secondary violations if a primary violation had been committed and not before. We have a lot of data that supports this, and I'm looking forward to jumping into the data as well, too. But overall, it's something that we're really proud of in the city of Philadelphia, and the data suggests that this, and I heard some of the questions earlier in the earlier panel, we're the only city in the country that does it, that has done it. And let me just give you one fact. So anybody who tells you that this promotes crime or anything like that, they're lying to you. So in Philadelphia, the homicide rate was 516 homicides per year when this law was implemented. I vividly remember the police commissioner asking me to wait because they felt like the narrative wouldn't go well. every year the homicide numbers have dropped by a minimum of 100 homicides since the law has been in effect. Now, let's be clear. I'm not saying that because of driving equality, we've been able to solve more crimes. I'm saying that with driving equality in existence, crime hasn't gone up. So anybody who says that crime goes up, that's not true.
Thank you so much, and thank everybody for having us and inviting us to this really great conversation. My name is Marqueece Harris-Dawson. I serve on the City Council of Los Angeles. I represent South LA. I also serve as the president of the council. And, I came to this work in an interesting way, in a kind of a circuitous route. Years ago, 25 years ago, I was a community organizer, and we organized young people. Oddly enough, we were organizing young people around the school to prison pipeline and expulsions and suspensions, which have similar data to traffic stops for anybody who studies that. The data is very similar. We'd organize high school students, and at certain point, some of those high school students would get to be 16, and they'd have a car. And so invariably, carload of boys coming to the meeting gets pulled over. And when you get there, you have to stop everything because they're traumatized. They're kids, really, even though they're old enough to operate a vehicle. They get the search and the whole 9 yards, and they come back. They're shaking. They're in the building, and you pull them into a room, and because I've been through this, so I know I got to hear them out, and we got to deal with this before we can meet. And one of them says something to me that stuck with me to this very moment. He looked at me and said, "I understand that we have to get in trouble if we do something wrong with the car, but why does the person have to have a gun?" To people who grow up in South LA, if you're a good kid, you spend your life avoiding people with guns. And here you're on the road, and you didn't ask for this at all, and suddenly you're being confronted by someone who, by the way, is just a little bit older than you, and a gun. And, they just said, I don't understand why the people who give traffic tickets have to have guns. It just doesn't make any sense. So fast forward, I eventually run for a city council, and the politics of Los Angeles have been, up until the last few years, that the police union and the homeowners groups really dominate the public safety conversation. Police ask for something, the council give them double what they asked for. It was generally politics. So I took the tack when I got to be an elected official that I'll do community policing because the police union kind of agrees with that, and we can get really good work done. And we did that work very successfully, by the way. Some of the most innovative community policing anywhere in the country, where officers are not rewarded for citations, they're rewarded for engagement, and they're rewarded for the overall drop in crime and the close rate of crime. So when a crime does happen, do people talk to you? Do the neighbors trust you? All that. So literally, George Floyd happens. The political situation changes literally overnight. Immediately, the very first council meeting, and I want to acknowledge one of my white colleagues, Mike Bonin. He said, "Let's do something on traffic stops." And I said, I'm all in. If there's a moment to do it, let's do it. So we put in the motion, and I remember Mike because I was reminded him by a council member from Denver. Mike got up and said that he spent, which I didn't even know this about him at the time, he said he spent 2 decades as a full-on drug addict. Full-on. And drove all throughout Los Angeles and was never pulled over once. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there. I've only been on the council, 5 years at that point? I'd already been pulled over twice as a council member in a city car. In a city car. So we put the motion forward, and the chief says, kind of like you, chief, said, I think you don't need an ordinance. We can figure this out. So he passes a motion. It's very aggressive. It drops. The traffic stops plummet. They go down to a very low number. Chauncey will know the exact data on that. I'm counting on you. And it stays low until we get out of COVID. and people start driving again. And very importantly, and not, I don't think incidentally, the police chief changes. And so now we're back up where traffic stops are where they were before the policy was ever passed, which says, okay, we got to bring this ordinance back out and make it law so that it's not up to individual chiefs or individual captains or individual officers. So May 6th, we'll be in front of council. We'll be bringing a motion, which, I'm certain we will win. I want us to win, 14-1 or 15-0, if possible. And then we think we'll get the results that we need. The last thing I'll say to add to this conversation is, the role of the police union. One thing I learned as an organizer, organizing around a variety of issues, but especially issues related to education reform, was that you could have these big policy wins, and if you talk to a teacher, they would show up the next day and do the exact same thing they did before, because guess what? They're following their students. They're not following the policy. So we knew we had to engage police officers at some level. So, we engaged individual officers who gave us a lot of data and gave us a lot of information, but we also engaged the police union, which, police union has never endorsed me for anything, and I don't expect that they ever will. They generally give money against me when I run, but we sat together and we said, let's figure this out. And after the conversation, oddly enough, they actually made the policy stronger than what we were going to propose. And the lesson from that is always have the conversation. One of the things they told us that we didn't have any way of knowing because we weren't police officers, they were like, the reason we do the stops is because of the search. So the thing you need to limit is the search. Because if an officer knows they can't do the search, they're very unlikely to try to do the stop or to find a reason to do the stop. Because they explained to us that's kind of how it goes. You see somebody, you want to stop them, you come up with a minor traffic violation. Then in the course of talking to them, you come up with another reasonable suspicion. Or between the time you stop them and the time you go to court, you come up with a reasonable suspicion. And they actually asked that and we're doing it, put in the motion that the reasonable suspicion has to be recorded into their body cam before they make contact with the driver. So there's no making up stuff after the fact, which we would have never thought of that on our own, by the way. Never, because we're not police officers, so we don't know how it goes. And so we're very excited about what is going to happen in Los Angeles. And very grateful to Philadelphia and Denver because we had to deal less with oh my God, crime's going to go through the roof. And we could say, no, look at Philly, look at Denver, we'll figure it out.
Yes, would you mind repeating the addition to the policy change that the union suggested?
So the language that the police union asked us to add was that if the officer for some reason, because we didn't ban every stop, but basically what they said is if an officer makes a stop, they have to record the reasonable suspicion into their body camera before they make contact with the driver. So that way, when you go back, if I go to court, and I say this officer pulled me over on a bogus reason, the officer's got to produce the video, right? And so if the officer, here's the other thing. The officer's not likely to say something into the camera like, this guy has a wide set nose, which I heard earlier in the conversation. Like, when you know you might hear it back, the theory is it changes what you are going to say. And so that's the addition that I think will make the policy more real in the streets than anything we could have thought of as activists, organizers, or policymakers.
Thank you all so much. So many of you talked about the role of national events and of personal experiences in motivating the policy intervention. Wondering if you have any reflections around what's changed the narrative about this policy locally, whether it's data, media coverage, but how the discourse has changed to support the policy.
No, the narrative hasn't changed. They hate me. I want to be very clear. No, it's not. It hasn't changed. It's never going to change. Driving equality was put into play in 2022, similar to the council president. They've been suing me for 4 years. We've won every single court case, and we could talk about the process a little bit later. But because we were very thorough and tedious, driving equality took me 2 years to pass. I introduced this before George Floyd, before anything. This was why I ran for office, right? This is public education. So, no, they hate me. It hasn't changed. And when I talk to other people in other cities, somebody said it earlier on a panel that was before this one. If I could do anything different, I would have made the dialogue not about black people in traffic stops. I would have made it about the idea of public safety and keeping everyone safe, because in the midst of us doing this work, what we found was police officers were more likely to be hurt in the midst of a traffic stop compared to anything else except for an event involving domestic violence. Domestic violence was somewhere where they were more likely to have something happen to them than a traffic stop. So for me, the narrative in Philadelphia hasn't changed. I think the good thing about what we've done is that, similar to what the council president said, other cities have looked at it and looked at crime and said, okay, well, this is something that we can implement because crime hasn't done. My best example is, ironically, Councilmember Thomas, no relation, in Memphis, after that unfortunate situation happened down there where the young man was killed in the midst of a police stop. Memphis essentially ended up adopting driving equality. So, and we've talked in Denver before this conversation as well. So I think for me, what has happened is that nationally, people have recognized the legislation and they've begun to implement it, but locally, constituents are fine. But police, the police union and other folks who are against the legislation, nothing has changed, because in politics, facts doesn't matter anymore, right? So maybe if this was a time when facts actually mattered and data actually mattered, then maybe I can convince some folks, but we are no longer in a space where facts and data matters, and most of folks' decisions and how they feel are emotional, and that's a whole nother conversation for another time.
I was just going to say, I mean, I'm heartened by the fact that I do have occasional conversations with people who understand the problem that low-level stops victimize certain communities and let others run free. But what I hear mostly is the voices that the only way they see public safety being achieved is by arresting people. They don't care whether it's for murder or a broken taillight. You know, I mean, people accept, sure, pull them over as a broken taillight. You're probably going to find something more. And as the chief told me and knows very clearly, that's just not what the data shows. Those pretextual stops come up with 0 most of the time.
Yeah. And here, the council member a moment ago, and how the narrative hasn't shifted, and what, you know, rather than focusing on the harm to black people, to focus on the shared interest in safety. And in doing this work, that's something that I've also found that can be more appealing to a broader audience, right? I think when you ask folks, whether it's anyone here in this room, do you care about safe streets? Do you care about having safe communities? Everyone can agree to that, right? But from there, I think what's often helpful to get people to come in the right direction is to interrogate the way we go about trying to satisfy that shared interest, right? And we go about it through policing and punishment, right? We pump billions of dollars into law enforcement agencies across the nation to stop people. And to what end, right? What are the results that we actually receive? If you heard the last panel, relying on policing and punishment fails to meet expectations, right? But for a variety of reasons, we continue to go along with the system in place, right? There's this idea out there that we have to have safety in conflict with racial equity, and that we can't have both. That's what the whole system is based upon, right? And Push LA, the coalition I lead, we fundamentally reject that idea. The idea that, hey, in order to have safety, we have to discriminate against people. We have to pull people over because of their race, ethnicity, et cetera, in order to make communities safe, is fundamentally flawed. That's the same line of argument that was used to justify slavery, as well as Jim Crow law, right? And pretextual stops racial profiling, the arguments used to justify that are just the current iteration of that. And when you break it down like that, people start to understand. And then from there, to shift the narrative, what we do is we pivot towards equitable solutions that meet everybody's interests, right? So rather than pulling people over and stopping them, giving them tickets, fees, and fines, having economic extraction, and harming people, not only themselves, but entire communities and generations, we say, hey, research shows, as well as some pilots, that when you invest in the root causes of traffic safety risks, it helps alleviate the concerns that everybody has, right? So in the earlier panel with folks, they talked about the things that do improve traffic safety, and that's addressing things like moving violations, not equipment or administrative issues. So speeding, DUIs, so on and so forth. Those things can be alleviated by, more transformative approaches as opposed to relying on tickets, fees, and fines.
Thank you. Chief Thomas, what would you say has helped change the narrative around this approach in the department?
I think honestly the reality that because I know when I first talked about doing this, I got the same reaction that my friend from Philadelphia got with Just Watch, and because I think people thought that they would see crime increase, and quite the opposite. Denver saw record decreases in just about every crime category last year, despite the significant reduction in traffic stops. And so I think that that has really helped at least officers understand that there is no correlation between these low-level traffic stops and community safety. I was just having a conversation with someone in the back earlier about how a more difficult conversation that I'm having. I mean, I think that the community is starting to see that there's no connection, but I think that there may be a connection between traffic enforcement and the perception of safety. Because, and I think the councilman knows this well. I mean, I'll go to a lot of community meetings and I'll talk about the significant reductions in crime in their communities. And they'll say, hey, it doesn't really feel all that safe. And I think what they're talking about is just their perceptions about what they see. So when they see, every registration tag expired in their neighborhood, they're like, well, it seems like the police don't really care. It seems like the police aren't really doing anything. And so I think that's that's a reflection of that isn't what we're focused on. We actually are focused on more important things, and that's why crime is going down, and that's why trust, I think, is going up, which is something that I'm measuring in Denver. Recognize that our trust in community is going up, but I think that it's still, I think, resulting in people thinking, well, the police aren't really doing anything, and so I don't really feel safe.
So Councilmember Thomas talked about people not really caring about data, but at the same time, it is one of the more powerful tools to help push for change around this work. Our colleagues from California, wondering if you can speak about the role of data in your work, given California's national leadership around data collection, as well as if there's been any kind of inside-outside strategy for some of the advocates in the room who can think about how to work with their council people.
In 2015, I ran a statewide campaign to pass the Racial Identity Profiling Act. And at the time was pretty monumental, because back then, aside from Connecticut, it was the first, it was the first state with a statewide system that created data collection on all police-community interactions. And for California, it was a tremendous undertaking, given the scale and complexity of our state. So we have about 40 million people in California, over 500 law enforcement agencies. They conduct over 5 million stops annually, right? So when you think about the vast scale, the complexity of the state, it was extremely difficult to figure out. But fortunately, we were able to pass the Racial Identity Profiling Act, and it's been extremely helpful for our work. Locally in Los Angeles and for other jurisdictions around the state. And the reason why it's been so helpful is because it's allowed us to move from anecdotal accounts of racial profiling, stories and lived experiences, which are all extremely valid and helpful, to having an evidence-based understanding of the problem, right? For quite a long time, black people, brown people have known that racial profiling is a significant problem, and so is the general public, right? There's been numerous incidents. Earlier they talked about Philando Castile, but there's also Sandra Bland, Keenan Anderson, George Floyd, and the list goes on and on. And in trying to address the problem, one of the things that we've constantly seen and say, hey, this situation occurred, there's significant public backlash, law enforcement associations are consistently able to try to explain things away, right? Oh, this was just one particular incident, right? Or perhaps this was happenstance. Or, you know, the argument that used to bubble up a lot more often is just a few bad apple officers, right? Which really tries to reduce the problem to that particular incident. But when you have the data, from my perspective, it allows you to see things from a much more systemic perspective. So it's not just this person was harmed, this person was traumatized or killed, but hey, we can see things on an everyday basis every time a law enforcement personnel interacts with a member of the public. And RIPA, as the catchphrase that we use for short for the bill, it's extremely helpful because it provides very granular information about what happens during these interactions. You can see who an officer decided to stop, the reason for the stop, actions taken during the stop, the results of the stop, and much, much more, right? And with that granular information, we're able to debunk a lot of ideas out there about what's actually going on and what should be done to improve things in the future, right? So it's really given us a valuable tool to understand the problem and then provide an evidence-based approach on how law enforcement agencies should move forward in the future.
Councilmember Harris-Dawson.
Yes, I think Chauncey's right. On the political side, you know, it's really I got to move 15 votes in the mayor. I got to move a variety of interest groups to get to the point where we pass a policy. And what data does is helps you tell a story. And it helps you tell a story to different audiences, right? So when I go and talk to the Chamber of Commerce, what the Chamber of Commerce cares about is response time and patrol. So I get to explain through data that comes from LAPD but is analyzed by Catalyst California. Here's the suck on personnel man hours for the police department that traffic stops, which deliver almost nothing, happen. So when the captain comes and tells you they don't have anybody for patrol, ask them how many people are pulling people over, right? And then, you know, I go to a neighborhood group and it's another story. Well, you know, the interesting thing about race is, you know, I always hate this notion that, oh, if you make it about black people, it's almost certain to fail, right? Which is unfortunately a reality in the community. But one thing I did learn through this process was the history says that things that are blatantly racist, particularly against black people in this country, are seldom rejected by the public. They're only rejected as a result of movements, and usually really big movements. I mean, people didn't find out the unfairness of Jim Crow in the 1960s. That wasn't a new discovery. What moved it was a social movement. And I don't know that social movement ever got the majority of the people on its side. It just got enough people to change policy, and more importantly, got the 5 people on the Supreme Court to agree with them. So whenever we're going through these things, and this is an issue where it's just deeply felt. I mean, you're not going to find a black person, like you're not going to find a black police officer. You're not going to find a black judge. You're not going to find a black mother. You're not going to find a black Republican who doesn't have a horrible experience with a traffic stop. They're not. And so I think for black people, it's very, very personal and seems obvious. And I think it's important for us to realize to the rest of the world that may not be the case.
Would anyone else like to add anything related to data, either findings or what has made the work more compelling or defensible?
Yeah, I think one data point that's important, because we always talk about the success, is the things that haven't actually gone well with driving equality. So while crime is down and traffic stops are down significantly, one of the things that we haven't been able to do is address the disproportionate number of people of color who've been stopped compared to their white counterparts. So you'll have a neighborhood in the city of Philadelphia where black people might make up less than 10% of the population, but still make up over 50% of the traffic stops in that neighborhood, which means we're literally just getting stopped passing through the community. That is still a concern. We haven't necessarily figured out how to address the disproportionate type of stops that still happen to Black people, specifically Black men in Philadelphia. But that's a data point that we are essentially looking to address and trying to figure out what do we do as it relates to the traffic stops being reflective of the population, right? So if Black men make up, hypothetically speaking, 30% of the population, we should make up around 30% of the traffic stops. Unfortunately, that's not the case right now, and so we're looking to do something about that. The second data point that I think will help anybody who's looking to advocate for such legislation in your city, when we looked at the data prior to driving equality, the likelihood of finding contraband during the traffic stop was 0.17%, right? 0.17.
That's the LA number too, right, Chauncey?
1%, right? We're not saying 1% of the time. I'm not saying that. I'm a math guy. This is not an error, right? That number has went up significantly after driving equality. Why? Because we're pulling people over for committing motor vehicle code violations. That's a public safety hazard, not pulling people over trying to hit the lottery. And that was our biggest argument, right? When you say, and I appreciate your comments around the police department in Los Angeles, because our argument the entire time was, if you're telling us that you need traffic stops to deter crime, you're basically trying to hit the lottery. You're asking people who's not from Philadelphia, because the majority of the police force don't live in Philadelphia. They're not from Philadelphia, right? So you're asking non-Philadelphians to look around the room and determine who looks guilty and who doesn't, and pull people over and search them based on that. The data says it wasn't working. And the reality is you can't judge Black people that way. This is how I look right now. I can guarantee you I did not look like this on Friday. And I was not in my city car either. So what is the difference between me and the criminal who you think you're trying to catch when you don't know anything about either one of us? That is not a data-driven way to solve crime. And we've seen this narrative happen in other places all across the country. So I just wanted to provide that data because I think it might help inspire some folks who's trying to do something similar in their community.
Thank you. And colleagues from Denver, so you're right now in the process of reviewing the data and considering potential changes. Is there anything you are able to share related to that?
Chief, you want to go first?
Well, I mean, I'm still a proponent of doing it through policy. I understand Councilman Kashmann's concern, and I, kind of related to the gentleman from LA who said that things changed when the chief changed. And I know that Councilman Kashmann's concern has always been, well, Chief, you're not always going to be chief. And so I think that he would feel more comfortable with something being in legislation as well. One of the reasons why I thought it was more important to do it through policy was because, one, I could do it quicker, and two, because, I don't know that there's going to be the votes necessary to get that across the line. I mean, I certainly will work with the councilman and give him the tools and maybe some of the things that I think would be value additive. Like I like the part about speaking things into the body-worn camera. I wrote a note to myself about that because I could certainly help him get what he wants and what I think is going to be effective across the line. But at the same time, he's got to get at least 7 votes.
Yeah, that is, I was talking with a council member from LA about that. I could come up with the policy that I want, that I think all of you want, and not get the 7 votes that I need. And if it's policy that our mayor doesn't like, then I need 9 votes. So what I have found in my time on council is that a lot of the ordinances that we pass are not that 100% that you'd like them to be. They're better than what you had before you went through the process. But to get back to data, the main thing that I believe is I think we need a bit more detailed and robust data collection on an everyday basis rather than once a year or once every 6 months flailing around trying to assemble things. We need to know on the short term how things are going, because we had a reasonable drop, a substantial drop in maybe the first 6 months that this policy was in effect. Then it went up to kind of a halfway decent drop, and now it's the first 3 months of 26, it's above where it's ever been. So we need to figure that out. And as the chief said, I may have been fooled, but I have faith in Ron Thomas. I think he's he's not just here for a couple of hours to speak to y'all. He's here for the entire conference. He shows up at community meetings and takes the hard questions. He calls officers to account when that's appropriate. But he ain't going to be the chief the whole time. And as all the legislators know, it's still, an ordinance is still just a piece of paper that the next council can undo. But it's a step in the right direction.
Chauncey, did you want to add something?
He kind of hit on it. If you don't have the data, how do you actually know whether what you're doing is effective, right? So in Los Angeles, as Councilmember Harris-Dawson mentioned, LAPD unilaterally adopted its own policy on pretextual stops a few years ago, and immediately after the policy was adopted, through the use of data, we saw that there was a significant decrease. Like stops for minor traffic violations, i.e. equipment and administrative issues, went down from 20 into the low teens. However, since then, under this new chief, the numbers have crept back up to pre-policy levels, and they're now accounting for about 20% of all stops that officers are conducting. And it gives rise to the work that we're doing today, right? It enables the council president to say, hey, this problem isn't solved. LAPD adopted its policy, but it's insufficient, so on and so forth. So I think it can be helpful in those sorts of instances too, and then perhaps also in Denver.
Thank you. So before we go to questions and give folks a chance to think about them or prepare their hands to be raised, just real quick, if there's anything that you each wish you knew before you embarked on this body of work.
I mean, I said it earlier. I just wish that I would have had a different narrative. I just think that the narrative was just too black. And that's just who I am. I'm unapologetically black. I noticed his pen right there. So it's like, and it's unfortunate because other people can be unapologetically loving their space and, whatever their pride is and their history is. And I represent the entire city. So I didn't say I'm, unilaterally, right? Like I love everybody, but it's a certain level of representation that we all have and we all come from. And whenever we try to do something that we feel like is to address a societal ill, if we say that there's societal ill, if the victims are black people, it's not a societal ill, it's just black people's problem. And I think that's where we were in 2020. And I think we've gotten either further down the road as it relates to that. So the only thing I would change is the narrative. When the narrative is more inclusive and people feel like it's something that impacts their life directly, they're more inclined to be open to the conversation. When they feel like it's something that gives someone else an advantage over them, or I guess this is our quote unquote civil rights, which is really not, that I think was alarming and triggering to people. So if I could change anything, I would have changed the narrative. I would have made the narrative about just this idea of public safety in general and not about, institutional racism.
I think what I wish I knew is how to convince people that there is more to public safety than badge and gun policing. It still amazes me how hard it is for people to understand that somewhat deeper context. But it's just essential that we continue to shout into what appears to be a void, because Denver's not the only city that faces this. Most cities I look at are underfunding all the public health strategies, and to touch the policing budget, which I don't have a great plan to do, Chief, is that's the ultimate sin.
Yeah, I think, yeah, there we go. Thank you. I think the thing that I've learned from this, and which is an odd thing to learn as someone who is a professional organizer, is the power of the right narrative from the right person is much more significant than the overall political environment. And, I'll never forget in our first hearing, we had the most, one of the most, he's not a Republican anymore. I think he was the only Republican on the council then. And I just figured, we're not getting him. And someone from his neighborhood just got up, and one of his big supporters just got up and talked about the traffic stop that they had. And I was shocked because he was shocked. I was like, dude, you live in LA, you didn't know this happens? And he didn't say this, but I'm saying it for this. He didn't know it happened to her. And that from that time on, the interaction with him has been totally different. That's the only thing that would have made him even remotely open to considering the policy. And if we had known that before, perhaps we wouldn't have had to wait till the George Floyd moment to move this policy forward.
Chief?
I wish I had known that the governor and the attorney general was going to tell me about how this was going to impact revenue for the state. Only because it wouldn't change my mind. But had I been prepared for the question, I probably would have had a better response into how that's just not why we should be conducting traffic enforcement in the first place. One of the things I want to continue, though, to think through is how to impact the perceptions of safety without, having to increase, our traffic enforcement.
Yeah, if I knew one thing in advance, I think it would be having the foresight of timing and knowing future events.
Wouldn't we all?
Because, as I mentioned, our work started picking up in 2019, and we're just now at the 5-yard line, as the council member would say. And then it started off, we had the wind at our backs, right? There was George Floyd, national uprising. Everybody was about it, But things have evolved. We now have the Trump administration, and with that, the political window has become way more complex. And the degree to which people are in favor of transformative system change when it comes to criminal legal system issues is not the same, right? And it's made things a lot more complicated and challenging in some respects. And, more specifically just to the work I do, like I work for a nonprofit organization, not a council member or law enforcement official. Our work is impacted by philanthropy, and the Trump administration has really attacked the infrastructure of our work for racial justice and for criminal legal system reform in a way that's unprecedented, right? He's directly attacked philanthropy, shakedowns and stuff on large institutions, as well as law firms and so on and so forth. That has had a trickle-down effect on our work at the campaign level, right? As organizations, we rely on resources to do our work, and when folks are spread thin and they have to pivot to a variety of things, and you have a multi-year campaign, it just makes things more complex to being able to, as folks said earlier, save lives and do the good work. He's also attacked the access to data, right? He's taken all the data off of websites that we need. He's attacking the political infrastructure and census and so on and so forth. So all these complexities going on in the background have a ripple effect on our day-to-day work. And in hindsight, right, if I would have known these things are going to happen, it may have changed our political calculus and how we went about things over the course of time.
Thank you. Any questions? Great. We'll start in the back and then work our way, zigzagging up.
don't care that you hurt black people. We don't in this country. They don't care. That's not how you move this thing. Look at all the black people you're hurting. They're like, and what's for lunch? So if we know that, and we keep talking about, not that we should stop, right? For those who, but you talk about all those other things that we talk about. And I get a lot of flack sometimes in my space because it's so off-putting and distasteful when I say approach it from caring about cops. And like, you know, I mean, I hear you, but the research also shows when people are not okay, when they are not well, they punch down. And that's what cops do, is punch down in the community. And what's helping them, if you want to have conversations with chiefs about instituting this type of deprioritization, talk about how it helps the cops become well. And the sheriff talked about that, right? We are sick of them ourselves. We're sick of bad apples. And the truth is, if you have one bad apple and 10 that don't talk about it, you got 11 bad apples, right? We get that. We know it's distasteful that you're saying, but y'all not talking about it on the police department. The other officers aren't. Look at the country right now. You don't talk about it because I've had people, I had a black female lieutenant ask me if I'm checking my car before I go home because I would speak up about things. Like, we will blow your shit up. You know what I'm saying? So if you talk to the chief and not need to be on the front page and say these things are better for your cops because there are cops that are sick of the people causing us all these problems. We're sick of the union dudes going to defend the worst of us, right? And we know these things are right. When you're talking about all the research you have, they're smart. When you make it make sense, when you take this data, and when you talk about how it's better, you're not paying out these horrific amounts of money, of taxpayer dollars, to lawsuits. So those are the type of things that I think really, if you have the ear of those folks, if you have your police chief, your council members, but truly, as the chief said, it's in policy, and you make it make sense to them. When someone's talking about the first line supervisors, sergeants, and I don't know, that was one of them. Sick of them. It's the biggest headache we have on our shifts. Those hot hands is going around trying to get into every person's pocket. It makes our whole lives miserable. So, you know, that's just another approach. For those of you who have that space to go into and have those conversations, and just let it be the conversation and watch the policies created, and let the magic happen on the other side. I don't mean to minimize it at all because it's not. It's huge. Just something I'm extremely passionate about. Some folks in the room can tell you. They asked me to come testify on a bill about deprioritizing traffic stops. I'm there yesterday. I love it because it's so very, it touches so many parts of our lives and of our citizens' lives. So anyway, I don't want to go on, but I mean, just thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. My question, I guess any of you could answer, is how have these incremental changes, whether it be policy or a police order, not policy, but ordinance or police order, how's that inspired other city leaders and police officers to address this issue in their jurisdictions? Like, I'm wondering if this can inspire a movement in the state if we were to, get police officers, state's attorneys on board, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's up to y'all. In Philadelphia, we did it first. The folks in Denver, this is not our first time talking. We've talked multiple times in the midst of the work that they've done. This is my first time talking to the folks from LA. I've talked to people from Memphis, Portland. I've talked to people all across the country about this issue. The thing is that when the George Floyd situation happened, and then when the situation in Memphis with Nichols, maybe. Yeah, Tyree Nichols. When that happened, people had like an appetite for this work. And I think the problem is when you are a victim of this space, you don't forget when it's not popular. And so when it was the popular thing, I was speaking at places all across the country, and then it died down. and now nobody wants to talk about it. So it was an honor to come up here today to talk about it right now in this moment when it's not the most popular, most sexy thing to talk about. But I think the appetite always depends on the legislators and what is politically trending and what's politically popular. When we did driving equality, not only was it something that a lot of cities wanted to replicate, I had people investing money and in creating documentaries and all type of stuff. And, you know, similar to what was said, then the money dries up and people don't care about their space anymore, and then they move on to the next social ill. So I think it always depends on the appetite of not just the elected officials, but the legislators. The advocates, the organizers, the constituents, the people in neighborhoods who say, I want to see this change. Because when constituents say they want to see something change, elected officials respond to those constituents, especially, like the sister said, when you on the side of right, because we know that this legislation is on the side of right.
And I would just tell you that Councilmember Thomas inspired me. I mean, he's the OG of pretextual stop legislation in today's modern context, just the truth, right? And what I particularly like about the councilman's approach is it no holds barred. You know, I'm working on a policy with the chief that gives a lot of room for officer discretion, whereas the councilman is a bit more instructional and a lot more required. So, yeah, I think it's going to carry on. I've had people from other jurisdictions in the Denver area say, hey, what are you guys doing? I think we need to do that here as well.
And if I may respond to that question also, having the success in other jurisdictions is extremely helpful for the campaigns that are still ongoing like ours, because it helps us offset a lot of the arguments, the hypotheticals that folks that are skeptical of what you're trying to do will bring up, right? There's this, from what I've seen, like every time we have a meeting with someone that's a little bit more moderate on the fence, there's this parade of horribles. What about this? What about that? And you can't account for every hypothetical situation out there because there's just too many factual scenarios that could bubble up. But what we can do is say, hey, they're doing it in Philly, and it's not the end of the world. In fact, it's not just end of the world, but things are better, right? The data show X, Y, and Z. And same thing in Denver, and so on and so forth. So I say extremely helpful for that particular point, and trying to convince people that are a little bit more moderate, skeptical, or conservative about what you're trying to do. And then second, the data from jurisdictions that have already passed something can help create better models. So to be specific, jurisdictions like San Francisco and others, one of the primary ways that they go about addressing the issue of pretextual stops is to prohibit stops for a specific list of offenses or traffic violations. That's one of the common approaches, right? So don't stop people for broken taillight, defective equipment, object hanging from a rearview mirror, so on and so forth. So there's a set list, right? Maybe 8 to 10 things. In San Francisco, they took that approach. And what they noticed is that after the policy was adopted, yeah, there's been positive impact in terms of stops based on these minor violations, but at the same time, they've seen an increase in the use of other stops that were not on the list that are also still equipment or administrative violations. And the reason is because the universe of equipment and non-moving administrative violations is quite expansive. In California, there's hundreds, right? So it becomes this game of whack-a-mole. Like, anybody ever been to the fair and you have that thing and you try to hit it, and then it pops up over here? So we're concerned about that. So we were thinking, like, how can we try to address this to make sure that we don't, end up just creating a new problem in a different form, and it's constantly kind of chasing this problem. So what we've been trying to offer up as a more comprehensive solution is to take a categorical approach and then kind of filter down from there. So instead of going from offense by offense, start from the category, right? Moving violations, equipment, non-moving / administrative. Those latter two are the realm in which we're trying to operate on pretextual stops, and then prohibit stops based on those categories and make exceptions from there based on, particular situations.
That really was very much related to my question, which was for all three cities, is someone going through all the many hundreds of bases for stops, figuring out which things should be secondary, which things really are safety related, which things can be repealed, and which things can be narrowed? And if so, are you finding a lot of consensus among road safety advocates, prosecutors, and others?
In Philadelphia, we did. And so I did not talk much about the process today at all. And I purposely didn't do that because it would monopolize the conversation. It took so much time. It was 2 years. And in the midst of that, those 2 years of negotiating, we did negotiate what those traffic stops would be. And I'll tell you, I'm not going to go into all of them. We have 8 in driving equality in Philadelphia. Some cities do it different, more or less. You got to do it fit your city. But I'll tell you 2 things. Number one, I always encourage people to reach out and ask for help. Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Denver, we're all big cities. We have big city councils, we have budgets with staff. A lot of people who want to replicate what we're trying to do have small budgets. They're small cities. They might not even have staff as an elected official. So I have an example, which is Pittsburgh, where they didn't reach out to us at all, and they didn't get it right, and they ended up getting sued, and it didn't get implemented. Then you have other cities who did reach out to us, and we helped them throughout the course of the process so that they wouldn't put themselves in a position to essentially be sued. So based on where we are and what we're trying to do, we encourage people to lean on one another, lean on us as it relates to this process so we can help you navigate your way through what does it mean to work with the police commissioner, because that's what we did. What does it mean to work with the executive branch of government, because that's what we did. And how do we pass legislation that put us in a position to where as though we've been challenged by the court 3 times. This is all the way up to the Supreme Court of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for no reason, right? And it's wasting taxpayer dollars. But we would not be at this point to continue to fight had it not been for the collaborative spirit and the collaborative efforts of everybody on a local level as it relates to Philadelphia. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I've got a question. I'm Christy Lopez. I've been working on these issues for a long time, and I notice, and I really appreciate I don't mean to be provocative or to try to sort of derail things, but we've been talking about, Chief Thomas, you talked about how you wish someone would have told you about the need to reduce, or the impact of the reduced money be coming in. Chief Burbank talked about how police officers cost more than the money they bring in. We've all talked about, policing was not created as a humane profession, and the need to reduce our reliance on policing and to be in the 21st century with relying, engineering and public health. But we have a really hard time talking in these conversations about, hey, maybe part of the answer to all this is fewer police officers and shifting those funds to all these other things. And especially in this budget environment, I don't know how you can get around that conversation, especially if you want long-term change. I understand how incredibly difficult and perhaps impossible it is to have this conversation in any productive way. I'm wondering, though, whether you disagree with that. And I also agree with, you don't need to be anti-police to say, maybe, I think if you really care about police, you think maybe we need fewer of them, better supported, right? But do you disagree with that? That should we be trying to do all this while keeping the police departments the same size? Or should we be trying to shift that? And if so, how, when, who should be starting those conversations, if not you?
Yeah, so I can speak to that because I don't know, council members have to decide on budget, so I don't want to put them in an awkward situation. I'm just kidding. But I'd say it's evolved over time, the degree to which there's that argument is appealing to everyone. So specifically the shifting resources part. I think talking about the cost of the stops definitely resonates, right? So Catalyst California recently did an analysis of LAPD stops for equipment violation and administrative violations. And we combined, through the use of RIPA data, the time spent on the stops, i.e. the duration, with the personnel costs from the city budget. And by combining those two, we were able to figure out that officers spend about 15% of their time on those stops. And we also figured out that the personnel costs for the part of LAPD that's doing everyday patrol is about $500-something million. And when you combine the two, the cost of stops for minor violations is about $77 million annually. And that's a very conservative estimate, right? I think when you put it in numbers like that, it helps people understand, like, hey, what's the return on investment? Because in the city of Los Angeles, fatal car crashes are going up over the course of time, right? There's significant concerns about making streets safer. We're pumping millions of dollars into stops, but it's not solving the problem. That part resonates. However, when we start to talk to folks about, hey, shrink the police department or take money out of the police budget, folks that are more moderate can tune you out because it sounds like defund the police, and it takes us back to 2020, 21, and things are a little bit more moderate nowadays. So we've had to try to walk a fine line about getting the issue to hit home, like what's the return on investment? We're investing dollars into this, but it's not giving the expected outcomes that we want, versus let's get rid of the police, because that latter argument is a little bit more complicated.
Denver colleagues,
Yeah.
did you want to add?
You know, I don't know if this is maybe the right answer to your question, but I'd like to have more police with less to do, if that makes sense. And so what I mean is that I think that there are a lot of things that we do that we shouldn't be doing. I think that there are a lot of things that we do that we're just not expert at doing. There are mental health professionals, there are other individuals that I think are better at doing the things that we have become accustomed to do or that we generally get called to do. And so I'd like to sort of uncouple that responsibility and give that responsibility to other people that are more expert in that, and then have those, even road safety. I mean, I think that there's a lot that can be done to improve the infrastructure so that there's less opportunities for us to have to engage in traffic safety, to give officers more time to engage with community, more time to be responsive to calls for service. So that's why I said I'd actually like to have more officers. I don't know how to resolve that from a budget perspective, but certainly recognize that that there are other things that I think should be done better by other people, while giving us greater capacity to do the things that I think are more helpful toward building community.
Yeah, I just, pardon me, Councilmember, I want to second what the chief just said. And again, I'm not a politician that's going to come out and ask for more police, so don't expect to read that in the paper that I did that. But the challenge for elected officials in cities, especially big cities, but cities all over the country, is the entire government's too small. So if I say go cut tree trimmers, or people who fix potholes, or sanitation workers, if I say cut any of those things, the residents have a negative reaction because from their point of view, they don't get good service. I'll tell you a story about policing to make the point. There's a grocery store in my district where the manager lives in a place called Fontana, which is an exurb. It takes like an hour to get to work. And he's talks about having been stopped 4 times when he's exiting in the freeway in LA to go to work. Gets pulled over, he has a Dodge Charger, he's black, the whole 9 yards, 6, 7 officers, 30, 45 minutes, 4 times in a year. He's like, I run a grocery store. Someone can come in, rob the grocery store, walk, not run, walk out to their car, get in the car, drive away. I call the cops. It takes 2.5 hours for somebody to show up. So he doesn't want less police. He just wants the police to be doing things that matter and not doing things that are by all accounts a waste of time. So I think that in the context where cities, almost no city that I know of in the country, even we border Beverly Hills, which is regarded as one of the wealthiest cities in the country. Even Beverly Hills is cutting their police department. Not because they're for defund the police or progressive or anything like that. They're just like, we don't have enough money. to keep doing all of this for the period of time, for the cost that it requires. And so I think we got to look at city government broadly and then look at policing in particular. And you can get to the question of what should the police be doing? What should they not be doing? Here's the other thing that happens with defunding of cities is a lot of cities, LA's like this, I'm sure the Philadelphia and Denver are like this too. Something needs to be done, and cities look up, and the only thing they have is police. So if all you've got is a hammer, it looks like a screwdriver to you. And so I think if you had more tools and more resources to build, train tools, you could begin to talk about reducing the scope and scale and role that police play in the lives of everyday people in big cities.
Yeah, I agree with the councilman 100% on. I think most cities that I talk to are underfunded. I've looked at Denver's tax liability, tax levels compared to other cities around the country. We've got room to increase our taxes, and you start talking about that and people start losing their minds. The approach, getting back to public safety, the approach that I've taken is to try to convince people that there are more effective ways to address public safety than simply more cops. I mean, I always phrase it the same. I believe we need a well-trained, well-staffed police department. I do not know what that number is. I would fully support some sort of coalition getting together and figuring out what that might be. But I just emphasize, I mean, Denver and Colorado has this reputation around the country of being this cool, green,
rich,
great. Yes, there's some dough in some parts of the state, but we fund mental health like bottom 10, 15% of the states. We fund drug addiction, education, the bottom 10, 15% of the states. It doesn't work. I want to make it easier on cops. I talk about trying to shut down the tsunami that keeps producing a whole bunch of people who, for whatever reason, believe the only way they can get their needs met are by turning to what we consider criminal behavior. I don't know anyone who wants to break into a bank or rob a store to feed their family. I will tell you, I am not a tough guy. I'm not a particularly brave man. If I need something for my kids, my grandkids, yeah, I'll break into your house. You know, I'll do what I need to do. I've been fortunate to not have to do that, so I can stand here all proud and try to be respectable. But if I need something for those that I feel responsible to, I'm going to go get it. So we need to shut that pipeline down.
So real quick, first hearing that Denver is strapped for cash is great news. I'm sorry to hear that, but you know, Colorado is like one of the richest states in the country, so the fact that you guys are where you are is interesting.
$200 million budget deficit this year.
Oh man, that's crazy. It makes me feel a little better. I think so for us in the city of Philadelphia, I believe the number is 91%. 91% of the police budget is salaries. The salary is determined through collective bargaining through an arbitrator. That has nothing to do with the city as far as the legislator or the executive. So 91% of their budget is already baked in. The other 9% is things like phones for homicide detectives and things like that. With that being said, I agree with everything everyone else said. The problem we have is that from a fiscal perspective, and this is facts. From a fiscal perspective, we should not pay somebody $131,000 a year to collect information because somebody walked into a police station. The infrastructure of what exists, some of those jobs should not be, we call it, FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police Union jobs. They should not be the case. And so when I first got into city council, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, when I first got into city council, they showed us a pie chart. And the pie chart showed what police spend their time doing. And for me, it was remarkable to learn that less than 15% of their time is spent solving crimes. I always view police as the entity to solve crimes. I didn't think about the fact that they have to do all these escorts, special events, construction. 85% of their time is spent on things that have nothing to do with crime. And from a fiscal perspective, cities would save a lot of money if we begin to think about other people who could do some of the things that we're asking police officers to do, which is why I agree. So for us in Philadelphia, we came up with a dual response program. So when someone is called because of a mental health issue, it's not just police that's coming out, it's police and a social worker. Not only does that save the city a little bit of dollars, right? But more importantly, we've seen that it has limited the amount of lawsuits that have happened with the city of Philadelphia because we're handling these situations a little bit better. So I would move more to a space and a place where some cities have traffic officers to deal specifically with traffic. They don't have a gun. They don't get the same salary. I would move towards a model like that where we're asking police officers to really focus on solving crimes. And if that can be their job, I think it could put us in a position where as though not only will we not need as many officers, our budgets would be significantly less. I want to say one other thing because I might not talk the rest of this panel.
It's over, so.
Oh, great.
Definitely won't.
There you go. We've said a number of times, and it just really bothers me, we've said a number of times that there are, just bad apples. I've argued, and I've done this since I've gotten to city council, some professions can't have bad apples. We don't settle for bad pilots, right? There's no such thing as, that was just a bad pilot. That's why those people crash. We don't settle for bad surgeons, right? That surgeon just didn't know what they were doing. That's why that mother died, or that's why that person died. There are certain professions as a society that we should not accept bad apples. And the reality is that there are a lot of professions where that's already the case. Policing needs to be in that category. And this is coming from a former teacher who says teachers should be in that category too. Some professions are so pivotal to our society that our society can't afford bad apples. And I would like us not to accept the fact that there are quote-unquote bad apples as police officers because we don't accept them in other professions and we shouldn't accept it in this one.
Thank you. Please keep the applause going for our wonderful panel. Thank you so much.
Okay, we're breaking for lunch. 2 important things. You can stay here or there's grab and go containers and you can go to the park. There's entertainment in the park for sure. And second thing, please be back by 1:30 sharp for our next amazing session. Thank you all.